Welcome back to the Metahumanism podcast. Today's episode is about continuing to examine and deconstruct Russia's imperialist myths. In the last episode, we looked at the 10 historical myths, which laid the groundwork for today's episode. So I encourage you to go watch that episode first, because that will give you a historical background to the conflict that's currently being waged by Russia, the war being waged by Russia against Ukraine. And but today we will examine specifically the propaganda and the lies about the current war that have been propagated since 2014, when the war actually started by the invasion of Crimea. For those who are new to this channel, I'm Bogdan, and this is the 8th episode of my podcast. And I encourage you to watch or listen to the introductory series about me and my podcast and why it's called Metahumanism, as well as the rest of episodes I produced to date. I encourage you to go and watch them all. Maybe you'll find something interesting in each of them. That's my hope, anyway. So today we will enter the realm of post-truth propaganda. Infowars, hybrid warfare, active measures, which is a term known from the Cold War, the KGB tactics. They used a lot of different approaches to spread propaganda in the West, in America and Europe, and to unsettle or destabilize the societies. For example, it is known that the KGB infiltrated some of the civil rights movement organizations. They tried to use it and stir up issues within America, and they never stopped doing that. I mean, for a brief period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a little bit of in the 90s, there was confusion, and Russia was not as aggressive outwardly, and there was chaos after the collapse. But once Putin came to power, he started consolidating. He's a former KGB agent. He started consolidating power and returned to the same tactics and the same playbook that the KGB used during the Cold War. So destabilizing America, influencing, lying about everything, about the war, about the origins of the war, about history, and influencing and sowing discord in America itself, in Europe, by this propaganda. For example, the Make America Great Again movement has been very susceptible and consumed a lot of Russian propaganda, and they have a very distorted view of what's happening and why it's happening. Anyway, that's a separate issue. So this barrage of lies and manipulations started immediately as soon as in 2014, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine in Crimea. That was the beginning of the war. The 2022 so-called full-scale invasion was just an escalation of an already ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, which Russia pretended it wasn't part of the conflict. It was just this Eastern separatists, and we'll talk about that today. Eastern Ukrainian separatists, which is a lie. So let's start. Myth number 1 is that Ukraine is not a real country. Ukraine is an artificial construct, historically part of Russia, and lacks a legitimate national identity. So we already covered most of this in the last episode, the historical myths, but that's the background against which such a claim is possible. This imperial history denying separate Ukrainian identity, which has always existed, always struggled against empire, and asserted itself. So the truth is that Ukraine has a distinct language, culture, and history going back over 1,000 years. Roots in Kievan Rus, which we talked about that last episode. It has repeatedly asserted itself, its identity, and its desire to be independent and to self-determine throughout history. In the early modern times, it was a Cossack state. In the 17th century, it was established, which was an uprising against the Polish nobility oppressing Ukrainians. And then during that uprising, the Ukrainian state, which became known as the Hetmanate, which is from a title of the leader of Cossacks, Hetman. So that state, in the documents of the time, it was known as Zaporozhian host, so the Zaporozhian Cossacks from Zaporizhia region, and that's what the formal title was at the time. But in historiography, subsequently, it's known as the Hetmanate because of the name of title of the leader, Hetman. So that uprising. So the Ukrainians. Bogdan Khmelnytsky was the leader of that uprising in the 17th century. He was very successful. He allied with the Crimean Tatar Khanate, which existed at that time. Unfortunately, the Crimean Tatar Khan was an unreliable ally, and he abandoned Ukrainians, the Cossacks, at the key moment in the battles. In the war against the Poles, the Polish nobility, and the crown, and so Bogdan Khmelnytsky, to find some kind of replacement, turned to Russia for military help, and they signed a treaty in Pereyaslav in 1654, allying Ukraine and Russian Tsar. And unfortunately, that was a huge mistake on his part because the Moscow Tsar interpreted it as Ukraine, as the Cossacks taking an oath of fealty, that they're his vassals and he can do whatever he wants. And basically, the Russia subsequently used that. Distorted that moment in history and used that document to deny Ukraine as a separate entity, and basically eventually they destroyed the Cossack culture and state completely. Peter I and Catherine II completed the destruction in the 18th century, and that was a huge it's a period in Ukrainian history known as the ruin because of the results of that oppression by the Russian Empire, which by then was known as the Russian Empire already. As last time we said, it's 1721 is when Peter I changed the name from Muscovy to Russia and officially and proclaimed himself the Emperor of all Russias. So okay, so that was Cossack state in the 17th century. Then after the next major attempt to establish independence was in the 1917, the Ukrainian Revolution during World War I. They established the Ukrainian People's Republic. It was a very chaotic period, but it lasted between 1917 and 1920. There were several coup attempts there were conservative forces, socialist forces, liberal and socialist forces, and they warred between each other. So it was a very complicated period, and I will probably look at it separately in a different episode. But basically, that was an attempt to establish an independent Ukrainian state. It also failed. The Bolsheviks overran that state. The Germans also, because of the World War I, there was clashes, and ultimately Bolsheviks overran most of Ukraine. Part of the Western Ukraine was occupied by Poland, controlled by Poland between the world wars, between the World War I and World War II, and so. But most of the rest of Ukraine was under Bolshevik rule, and then the western part of Ukraine was also occupied by the Bolsheviks after World War II. And most recently and decisively, Ukraine became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. There was this attempt at a coup in Moscow in August of 1991. These hardliners within the KGB and the government wanted to overthrow Gorbachev because they disapproved of his more liberal policies, but it failed within 3 days. And Ukraine used that Ukrainian parliament used that chance to proclaim independence. And then in December of that year, 1991, on the 1st of December, there was an all-national referendum in Ukraine, and 90% of Ukrainians in all regions voted for independence. There were different percentages in various regions, some regions more decisively, other regions less so, but every region voted, majority in every region voted for independence. including eastern and southern areas, which are now currently being occupied by Russia and are a war zone at the front line. The Crimea, the Donbas, they all voted for Ukrainian independence in 1991. So the claim that Ukraine is not a real country is absolutely ridiculous. This whole argument is even possible largely because of a certain bias within the dominant approach to history writing. There's a typical focus and bias towards state structures rather than national or communal units. So because many formerly colonized and stateless nations face this dilemma and struggle to decolonize their history and to establish it properly centered national historical narrative. And that's what Ukraine is also struggling with against the Russian imperialist myths. Even in the 1990s, the Columbia University historian Mark von Hagen even published this provocatively titled article called "Does Ukraine Have a History?" That was in 1995. And the point was that, yes, Ukraine has a history, but the point is that it's because of the statelessness and colonization, it's not easy. It has to be decolonized, and the historical narrative has to be corrected and reflect the actual experience of the Ukrainian people and the nation. So despite gaining independence, Ukraine has struggled in the past 3 decades with overcoming Soviet legacies such as social atomization, lack of community spirit, demoralization because of the sick totalitarian society that dominated for several decades, corruption, widespread corruption. Ukraine has struggled with it and actually has made some progress as opposed to Russia, where corruption became a state policy and kleptocratic system under Putin, endorsed by him. Russian imperialist domination also is something Ukraine has been struggling with, and all of these legacies have been much harder to overcome and uproot than just merely gaining in independence and on paper formally, right? So the Russia continued to, even in the 90s, even before Putin, there was constantly influence from Russia, business interests, attempts to control what's happening in Ukraine, in Ukrainian politics, and it definitely stepped up since Putin came to power in 1999. There was various moments. The Orange Revolution was a big one. Again, there was a pro-Russian candidate, the same one that was ousted in the EuroMaidan revolution in 2014. Yanukovych, and when he was finally ousted in 2014, Putin realized that he was losing his grip on Ukraine, that Ukraine may be successful in becoming fully free and independent of this Russian influence and underhanded attempts to control and infiltrate Ukrainian politics, and so he invaded because he saw that as the only solution to his continued desire to control Ukraine and to rebuild the empire. So he invaded Crimea and then Donbas. Okay, so that was myth number 1. Myth number 2 is that the 2014 Maidan revolution, the EuroMaidan movement, was a CIA-backed coup. Still repeated by unwitting idiots and propagandists from Russia. The EuroMaidan uprising was orchestrated by the West, according to them, and they installed the puppet regime and so on. Truth is that EuroMaidan was a grassroots democratic revolution. It came to be known as Revolution of Dignity, sparked by Yanukovych, which I just mentioned. He was a pro-Russian, this wannabe dictator who extremely corrupt criminal background. And he decided to renege and reject the EU association agreement, which he prior to that had promised to sign. When he didn't sign it, the students came out to protest. They were then beaten, and then the mass protest started as to defend the students. Basically, the nation rose up and saying they're beating our kids, we have to go and protect them. And so that became a mass movement, and millions of people. At the peak of the protests, they're saying above 1 million people were out in the streets and protesting, and that's not something CIA can orchestrate. It's not that's not how a coup looks like. If you go through history, that's how a mass popular revolution looks like, a grassroots democratic movement. And it became about Ukrainian future, about future with Europe, future of the dignity, democracy, and self-determination against the Russian corrupt and dictatorial and despotic way of governing. So Western involvement was actually minimal and did not drive events of the EuroMaidan at all. So this idea of far-right coup was which was supposedly conducted by this Victoria Nuland, who came. She was a State Department employee at the time, who came and gave out cookies on the Maidan to the protesters, and that's a sign that there was a coup. Because the cookies is how CIA does coups in our days, I guess. She was actually, she came to Kyiv during the protests because she actually wanted to broker an agreement with the Yanukovych regime to prevent further bloodshed and an escalation of the revolution and destabilization of Ukraine. And they were trying, the U.S. ambassador and her, they were trying to broker an agreement between the protesters and the Yanukovych regime to prevent some kind of civil war or bloodshed. They failed because the protesters did not, by that time, they were already sniper shootings happened and people were killed. The unarmed protesters, many of them unarmed, were killed by the snipers, and people were not going to accept any kind of settlement because they thought they sought justice. They wanted justice, and they were not going to let Yanukovych continue to stay in power after what happened after he attacked his own people. So U.S. was actually trying to make a compromise with Yanukovych, and which was rejected by the people. And then Yanukovych packed his bags, stole everything he could still steal, packed his helicopter, and escaped eventually to Russia, and where he stays to this day. And his former building he built for himself, this opulent estate he built in the suburbs of Kyiv in Mezhigirya, became a museum of corruption because it was just it showed how just ridiculously unhinged it all was, the corruption and the way they wasted their money just to live lavish lifestyle and just abuse the people. So there were some issues about who were the snipers. Were they Russians who were supporting Yanukovych, who came in, Russian special forces? There were theories about that, and there are some other theories said that these snipers were actually from the Maidan side. They were the shooters and killed the people, and there was only literally one person who created this conspiracy theory and pushed it, and consistently continues to this day to push it. It's the one academic political scientist in he's a Ukrainian roots, but he lives in Canada and teaches political science there. And he's I've known about him even before this Maidan, and he's always pushed all kinds of narratives against Ukraine, criticizing, and I'm not sure what his deal is. I don't want to speculate whether he gets paid for what he does, but he's very active in reaching out to media and spreading these false narratives. And he even published a book about this Maidan massacre and claiming that it was all a conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate government, supposedly, which is ridiculous. And I will link an article analyzing this conspiracy theory and showing how it's comes up short and is not grounded in reality. So Now back to yeah, so that's myth number 2. Myth number 3, Russia had to intervene to protect Russian speakers in Ukraine. We kind of touched upon that in the past episode, in the previous episode. Russian-speaking Ukrainians were under threat and needed Moscow's protection. Complete and total fantasy. Russian speakers in Ukraine were not under attack. Russian was and still is widely spoken in Ukraine, especially in the east and the south. Many Russian-speaking Ukrainians, including in such large cities like Kharkiv, very close to the border with Russia, or Odessa in the south, they have resisted Russian aggression, and there is no support for Russian war in Ukraine. Russian speakers or Ukrainian speakers or Swahili or German or whatever, nobody supports Ukrainian Russian aggression against Ukraine. There may be some minorities, some traitors that are sitting quietly, but the majority, overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, regardless of language they speak, are opposing the aggression. The narrative of protection is complete fabrication, just a pretext for invasion. And as we already discussed in last episode, language is just not a good indication of a political affiliation at all, or identity. Many people in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine were Russified violently and forcibly by the Russian Empire in the past. That's why they speak Russian, or during the Soviet Union. That's why they speak Russian, not because they are ethnically Russian or because they believe they want to be ruled by Russia from Moscow. No. They are Ukrainian, they want to live in Ukraine, they want to have a normal life and nobody invading and destroying their cities. Actually, the invasion of the Russian invasion actually turned a lot of these people. They woke up and they realized their terrible history and why they speak Russian. They started learning Ukrainian. A lot of people have switched and are switching to Ukrainian just because they realize they don't want to support the imperialist Russia, and they don't want to even give them pretext to say that they are protecting them because they're Russian speakers. Actually, just two moments where Russia in history, in the 19th century, Russian Empire wanted to outlaw Ukrainian language. In 1863, there was the Valuyev circular. That was an interior minister. Valuyev is the last name. And his circular was prohibited all religious and educational publications in Ukrainian, only allowing like fiction and literature, belles lettres, as they are known. So fictional literature was fine, but no educational, philosophical, religious, literature in Ukrainian was allowed. And then there was an Ems Ukaz by the emperor himself, Alexander II, I think at the time, 1876. That decree was again restricted the publication and even importation of religious and social political literature into the Russian Empire from abroad in Ukrainian language was prohibited, and also staging any kind of theater plays or lectures in Ukrainian was also outlawed. Okay, so notice this contradiction in propaganda. On one hand, the Russians deny that there was a separate Ukrainian identity and language, but then on the other hand, they had to prohibit it historically. So why would you, if there was no separate language, why do you need to prohibit it? That's one. And secondly, if you say it's a Polonized dialect of Russian and claiming the Russian language is being discriminated against in Ukraine, where's the evidence? There was no discrimination of Russia before. Right now, Russian is viewed in a hostile manner in Ukraine, in some ways, because it's a security issue, because Russia attacked. Before that, there was no discrimination, and that's complete fabrication. But after the invasion, obviously, people are, you attacking us, so why should we respect your language, and why should we even, it's a security issue. If you speak the same language as your aggressor in your communications and they catch it, Russians, not every Russian understands Ukrainian, despite what they claim. Ukrainian is a very different language, and a lot of Russians don't even understand what Ukrainian says. So, for military communications, it's a security issue, for example. So it's only natural that, if you're aggressively attacked by somebody, you're not going to like their language much, or culture, or history. Myth number 4. Ukraine is run by Nazis, okay, or that the war is about denazification of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian government, after overthrowing Yanukovych, is a fascist or Nazi regime oppressing minorities. Again, complete and total fabrication and grotesque propaganda lie. Ukraine is a pluralist democracy. Current president Zelensky is Jewish, has a Jewish background. It's widely known. Far-right groups do exist in Ukraine, as in most countries. In most European countries, some of them are even in the parliament and in European parliament. Some of the right-wing groups, not very much influential, but they do have some presence. But they have minimal in Ukraine. They have minimal political power. They don't have any influence. Obviously, since the war, these people who are fighting and who have far right views, they're defending Ukraine, so they will be, they are present and they are participating in the war. But you have to defend yourself when somebody attacks you. There's nothing you can say about that. It's just a basic right, to defend yourself. So this narrative is just meant to revive this Soviet-style anti-fascist rhetoric to justify war. And this whole idea of denazification runs very deep and reaches back into the Soviet times. This propaganda, after the revolution was defeated in 1921, the Ukrainian national movement for independence took a rightward turn. So they abandoned, because the Ukrainian People's Republic that movement was heavily socialist and progressive, and because of its failure, the next generation kind of rejected all those ideas, and they adopted a lot more conservative and explicitly nationalist ideology. It's a very complicated history. Again, separate treatment will be needed. There are different maybe videos sometime in the future. But the point is that the Bolsheviks used that, and they created this term bourgeois nationalism, and anybody who wanted Ukrainian independence, regardless actually of the views, they even persecuted Ukrainian communists who wanted independent Ukrainian state. Even with communist ideals, they were persecuted and purged by Stalin in the 30s. They were all shot en masse, all the Ukrainian communists, and there was a Ukrainian national communist movement at the time, and they thought they could use this Soviet Ukraine to build a Ukrainian country, a Ukrainian state based on communist ideas. At that time they thought it was possible, but Stalin showed them that was not possible, and they killed them all. It's known as an executed renaissance in Ukrainian history, because the whole generation of intellectuals, political leaders, writers, artists, they were all rounded up and shot in 1937 during the Stalinist purges. In addition to the genocide of the Ukrainian peasants in several years before that. That nationalist movement in World War II, there were several factions within that movement. They organized a partisan army. They fought bravely and fought against the Poles, against the Nazis, against the Bolsheviks in different periods. It was a very complicated and convoluted history. Again, separate treatment needed, but by 1950s, when the war ended, they continued to resist underground in the forests. It's a partisan army, and created much problem for the KGB. But eventually, they knew they weren't gonna defeat the Soviet regime, but they still fought because they had no choice. They weren't gonna accept the Bolsheviks' rule because they knew how criminal it was, and so they were defeated by 1950s. And a lot of them immigrated after the war, the Ukrainian nationalists, into different countries across the world, USA, Canada, Australia, some European countries like Germany, Britain, and Argentina, Brazil. So there are Ukrainian communities, immigrant communities that created Ukrainian diaspora communities since then. That's how I'm also living in the United States. I'm also part of Ukrainian diaspora now, and there are all these organizations created after the war. So because they were escaping the Stalinist regime, who they knew would either kill or send them to Siberia, to the Gulag. So that was the only choice. They had to escape. Now, the KGB propaganda used this moment in history, this nationalist, they used this one nationalist leader who became legendary, Stepan Bandera. He was just a leader of one faction. He was actually imprisoned by the Nazis during the war. Most of the war, he didn't even participate in the war. But they used his name, the KGB, to label anyone who supported Ukrainian independence or Ukrainian nationalist ideas as bourgeois nationalists and Banderites, or whatever the term, Banderivci. And then the KGB actually mythologized Bandera as the supervillain that collaborated with the Nazis and massacred non-Ukrainians everywhere. Which is exaggerated and not exactly true. There were various moments, unfortunately very dark moments of history on Ukrainian lands. It's known as the Bloodlands, using Timothy Snyder's term. He wrote a book about this. You know, the whole Eastern Europe caught between Hitler and Stalin, the Bloodlands, Ukraine included. And there were some dark pages of history, but this is a KGB using that history to exaggerate, to demonize Ukrainian desire to be independent and to deny Ukrainian political identity. And the irony of all of that is the Bolsheviks themselves, as some political scientists point that out very clearly, especially more and more now, in a very real sense, they can be seen as red fascists. The communism was all merely a facade ideology they used to justify what they did, but the genocidal policies, the Gulag, the mass shootings, and they used very similar policies to the ones used by the Nazis. They were just another totalitarian regime, not much different. They're just fascists in practice, communists in ideology, in outward ideology, and they presented, after the war, Stalin used that propaganda to propagandize themselves and style himself as anti-imperialist and anti-fascist leader and winner of the World War II. But in fact, he collaborated with Stalin to start World War II. And he was as imperialist as they come, and his practices can be described as fascist in many ways. So, and unfortunately, that propaganda, after post-war Cold War propaganda, has been successful in many quarters, especially, let's say, on the left, on the extreme left, especially. There are people who to this day believe in Stalinism and think he was a brilliant leader, he was a savior of humanity, and he opposed the imperialist West and all that kind of nonsense. He was just as evil as Hitler, and the regime in Soviet Union was just as horrible and hateful as the Nazi regime. Myth number 5, Crimea voluntarily rejoined Russia. The Crimean population freely chose to become part of Russia via referendum in 2014. Nonsense. The truth is that 2014 referendum, quote unquote, it's not a real referendum. It was held under military occupation at gunpoint. The question was asked pretty much in a style of you will join Russia and we want to join Russia. Yes, I don't oppose. Those are the choices. Either I'm for it or I'm not against it. You know, that was not literally, but that's pretty much what it came down to. It was not a real referendum. It was not a free and fair way to express your popular will, and it was under military occupation. You know, nobody recognizes that for that reason. It's illegal invasion and occupation of Crimea. There was no international monitoring. There was heavy propaganda and intimidation, and it violated Ukrainian and international law. You know, by invading Crimea, Russia violated I don't know how many dozen different treaties it signed up to in previous decades. Independent polls before the invasion showed that majority supported remaining a part of Ukraine. So it's Russia attempting to rewrite history and spread lies. So to reiterate, it was Russia who started the invasion of Crimea after Yanukovych escaped. They sent in these called green men, quote unquote, because they were unmarked Russian military pretending to be Nobody, just who knows where they came from, and they this hybrid warfare, providing deniability that Russia is not involved. Eventually, Russia recognized it was them, and they annexed it illegally again, and voted. You know, the Russian parliament voted for annexation and everything, totally illegal, totally unrecognized, and that's why today any attempt, what Trump is doing, trying to recognize or trying to include recognition of Crimea as Russian, it's a terrible precedent to set, because that kind of justifies and validates the policy of land grabs in 21st century, which is a horrible precedent to set, and it's the stupidest policy possible by the United States government. So hopefully that will not happen in any shape, way, or form, and that's why all of Europe is against it. Myth number 6. Ukraine was planning to attack Russia or Donbas, and so Russia launched a preemptive war to stop NATO and Ukraine from threatening its security. Again, complete lie. There was no credible threat from Ukraine. Ukraine was not about to attack Russia or occupy some territories in some pretext. NATO, we'll talk about NATO in a minute, but basically there was some resistance to the Maidan, EuroMaidan movement in various regions, but it was small, it was marginal, and it would not have turned into anything serious without Russia's instigation and help. These same very green men from Crimea then started appearing in the Donbas area, you know, the same unmarked military forces, and they started stirring up the so-called separatism. A related claim, some people say that there was a civil war between 2014 and 2022. There was a civil war and Ukraine was bombing Donbas and killing people there, Russian speakers or even ethnic Russians there. Again, lie and distortion. Yes, there was a war going on between Russia, who invaded and instigated this so-called separatism. These were literal Russian agent, Girkin, or his other name is Strelkov, Borodai, Motorola, some of the known leaders of that so-called separatist movement. They were Russian agent of Russian military intelligence or FSB, security services. This is known, and then they openly, there are videos of them, I'll try to find and link to them. There are videos of them admitting that, yes, we stirred it up, we started the whole war, and if not for us, it wouldn't have happened. You know, and that's what that's the truth. And during that period of 8 years, Ukraine just Ukraine didn't enact martial law during those first 8 years for legal reasons, and they called it anti-terrorist organization, and it was a lower scale war, and so they tried to put it down, this kind of quote unquote separatism. They tried to control it and to prevent it from igniting into something larger. That's why it wasn't, and also Russia kept denying that it was involved. There was, you know, they pretended there's these Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, that they're not Russian. Russia recognizes them, but they're not Russia, is not a party in the conflict. But at the same time, it participated in the negotiations. So it's just a lot of lies, a lot of dissimulation, a lot of propaganda and just hypocrisy. One of the worst moments of that early stages of the war was in 2014, when the Malaysian flight MH17 was shot down with almost 300 people on board were killed, civilians, completely innocent civilians. These are, and it was, the independent investigation confirmed this. It was a Russian Buk 2 rocket launcher that was brought into Ukrainian territory occupied by Russians, these Russian so-called separatists. Shot down they thought they were shooting down some military plane, but they shot down this commercial airliner. Once they realized this Buk 2 rocket launcher was very quickly taken back into Russia. There's videos of that. I remember watching these videos, how this happened, and it's going through Ukrainian roads and back into Russia. And the independent Dutch investigation, and there were several, I think, investigations confirmed that, and it's beyond doubt. It was Russians who shot down that plane, for example. But they keep propagandizing and denying it to this day. So and also like the Minsk agreements were trying to broker some resolution to that conflict. Russia itself did not violate the agreements, because they were part of the agreements was that they had to move the heavy artillery back from the front lines and to allow for ceasefire and for peace. But Russia never did so. So Ukraine was not able to hold up its side either, because why would you stop defending yourself if the aggressor is not holding to the agreement? Anyway. Myth number 7, NATO expansion forced Russia to act. Russia was provoked into war, but NATO's eastward expansion. Again, total fabrication and nonsense, and anybody who has a clue knows this and always knew this. NATO is a defensive alliance, and it does not expand aggressively. Countries can apply for membership, and then they can be, all of the members of NATO have to approve the membership so that the organization can enlarge and admit new members. It's a voluntary process. Nobody's forcing, nobody's invading anybody. It's not an expansion in that sense, the way Russia is doing imperialist expansion by attacking Ukraine, Georgia, and other countries around it. The truth is that in 2008 there was a Bucharest summit of NATO, and there was a talk about Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. But Russia pressured Angela Merkel at the time, and NATO did not reject the application of Ukraine on Georgia, and they did not extend membership to these two countries. And what did Russia do? That same year it invaded Georgia. In 2014 invaded Ukraine. In 2022 escalated that war further. Okay, so it's not about NATO, and since the 2022 escalation of the war against Ukraine, Finland and Sweden joined NATO as a result of that invasion, and so the NATO actually is now on the border with Russia and Finland, much longer border than before. And what did Russia do? It took all the military it had along that border and moved it to Ukrainian war, because it's not about NATO at all, and that's a clear indication of that. It's not about NATO. Russia is not afraid of NATO. It's just a pretext for its imperialist expansion. And there's just no two ways about it. Myth number 8, Ukraine is a puppet of the West. Ukraine has no independent policy. It's merely a tool of the US and the EU. It's a proxy war, right? The truth is Ukraine has made its own democratic choices along the way. While Putin was in power since 1999 until now, pretty much, and even when Medvedev was ostensibly president, it was just a kind of like a chess move to make sure Putin stays in power. He was just a puppet of Putin's. It was all, so it's a dictatorship, it's a fascist dictatorship, kleptocratic regime that Putin established. In Ukraine, there were free and fair elections. Orange Revolution was about having free and fair elections, and there were 5 presidents in the meantime. So there was a democratic choices. Pursuing integration with Europe was one of the choices of the Ukrainian people, which Yanukovych reneged on, and that's why EuroMaidan happened eventually. The claim of this puppetry denies Ukrainians their own political agency and serves to dehumanize their struggle for sovereignty, independence, and freedom from the imperial past. That's all it is. And as I showed in the preceding analysis of these deeply entrenched historical imperialist myths, the previous episode, this line of argument is just not credible at all. Ukrainians have always struggled for freedom and independence, and only the unfavorable historical and geopolitical conditions always thwarted Ukrainians from gaining their own state and keeping it. Internal betrayals, external betrayals, as I said, Crimean Tatars, for example, betraying Cossacks. Geopolitical factors prevented Ukrainians from achieving that goal and keeping the independent state without being invaded by somebody else like Bolsheviks. So that was just the historical, unfortunate, tragic, and traumatic history of Ukrainian people. And the recent events surrounding the Trump administration's attempts to strong-arm Ukraine into signing over the mineral deposits or the peace treaty clearly show that Ukraine is now no puppet and no proxy regime and is not for sale to anybody. Only the sovereign Ukrainian people have the right to determine what happens to Ukraine's resources and territories. Not Putin, not Trump, not anybody else, but Ukrainian people. And those folks who keep talking about this proxy war argument, they can't really explain how, if Ukraine is such a proxy for US, how is it not succumbing or just passively accepting whatever ridiculous demands the Trump administration is trying to push on Ukraine? How does a proxy behave like that? Where's the logic? There's no logic in it. Myth number 9, Russia is fighting against global Nazism and the Western decadence, the gays and propaganda and so on. There's many different facets to this claim. So the war is a broader spiritual and civilizational battle against the West. Truth is, this is just a quasi-religious, fascistic narrative. There's Alexander Dugin is the ideologue of this neo-Eurasianist, neo-fascist vision of Russian civilization, special civilization. It is used to mobilize domestic support for war and frame the invasion as some holy war, like a mission, like a crusade. It's rooted in deeply authoritarian worldview, which I mentioned last time, the Caesaro-Papist tradition of, this kind of the state is seen as end all and of all and the only possible way of organizing society, this kind of despotic state and czarist regime, authoritarian regime. And so they equate liberal democracy with moral decay, so because they show, liberal democracy is chaotic, so our despotic and authoritarian regime is the way to go. That's their argument. This connects also to the historical myth, which I mentioned last time, the Third Rome, after the Western Roman Empire, the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Moscow, supposedly the third center of Orthodox civilization. Total fantasy. It's and some kind of savior of the people, of the Christian people, of the white people, traditional values, and opposing to LGBT propaganda and this and that, the gay Europe, and they use those terms. That's the Russian. It's outlawed. Pedophilia is not outlawed in Russia, but the gays are. So that tells you a lot about what values they are actually defending. So it's just a fantasy and a lie. And last but not least, myth number 10, Russia is liberating Ukraine from oppression. The invasion is a liberation mission welcomed by ordinary Ukrainians. And that's why they erase and destroy all the cities, Mariupol, Bakhmut, and a dozen other mid-sized cities in Ukraine have been erased and destroyed, completely bombed into oblivion. I actually visited Bakhmut back in 2003. So I briefly, during the summer, I had a project going there. It wasn't a very successful project. It wasn't very well planned out, but that's a different issue. But and I visited Mariupol at that time as well, Azov Sea. I never been before, and I wanted to see it. So now it's just shocking to me to think that there's nothing there now where I've been before. It's ground zero. They erased these cities. They destroyed them completely. Is that liberation, quote unquote? I'm sorry, but that's just as Orwellian as can be. Ukrainians overwhelmingly oppose the invasion, and Russian forces have commit mass atrocities all the time. They kill civilians, they kill children, they persecute religious minorities, they destroy cities, they cause immense suffering. It's not liberation. It's not liberation. It's oppression, and it's just destruction for its own sake. It's not even, there's no constructive no positive or creative even iota of creation or positive ideology. It's all about destroying, causing suffering and causing pain. That's all it's about. And in growing your empire, just dominating somebody else who refuses to be dominated. So it's a continuation of what I discussed last episode, the long-standing imperial mythology about the superiority of Russian culture, about this grand narrative of Russian civilization, special kind of peculiar civilization, messianic almost vision that they are destined to rule the world and to be dominant and to be a great power. And that's what Putin is doing. That's why he attacked Ukraine. That's why he attacked Georgia in 2008. That's why he keeps all these frozen conflicts in Moldova, the Transnistria region, and why Belarus is under his heel, and so on. He just doesn't let anybody. If Ukrainians and Belarusians are successful in establishing free, democratic, stable, prosperous countries, the Russians will start asking questions. Why can't we live the same way? Why do we have to live in this such a despotic and authoritarian and kleptocratic regime that steals, that abuses us, and that doesn't allow us to have rights? While, Ukrainians can do it, Belarusians can do it, these Georgians can do it, why can't we? There is no answer to that question. And Putin is afraid of that the most. That's why he's paranoid since the Orange Revolution, these color revolutions. He's paranoid about the same thing happening in Russia. There was a moment in 2011, it escapes the exact, but there were some protests, pretty massive protests in terms of Russia, relatively speaking, several 100,000 people came out, but they were defeated. And since then, he just he established such an oppressive and almost again totalitarian system that everybody's afraid and nobody's speaking out, and only the only ones who are against it had to immigrate, and even they are very mild about criticizing Putin because he kills people even abroad. Like in Britain, there were Agent Litvinenko, Skripals. I will link some of these references just to remind you about what Russia is. It's about murder, destruction, and domination. It's not about liberation, it's not about civilization, and it's not about NATO expansion or any denazification or any other tall lie they propagandize about day in and day out. Only fools believe any of that. Only fools, clueless fools who don't know history and who are biased beyond belief for whatever other reason they may be, and don't understand what they're talking about. So hopefully this video will help some and bring some clarity to people who may be questioning or may be uncertain or confused about certain issues. I've tried my best to highlight everything and all these lies, ridiculous and completely fabricated lies. Thank you again for listening, for viewing, for supporting my content. Please support Ukraine if you haven't. If you do, thank you very much. Wherever in the world you are. If you don't, please consider supporting if you can. Support my content as well. Like, share, subscribe to my channel. If you can provide some financial help, I include all these links. It's up to you, obviously. I would appreciate it greatly. I have great ideas and for future for this channel, and I hope to develop it to something very worthy and very valuable, hopefully, because there's much to talk about, and not just Russian war in Ukraine, philosophy, other issues in the world happening. And the next episode, just a little announcement, will be about the anti-psychiatry and critical psychiatry movements. This will be my response to a request by one of my viewers who asked me to do an episode on this. I was planning to do that in the future anyway, but that request kind of moved it up in the schedule, and I will do the next episode on that matter. Completely different from what I'm talking about now, although there will probably be some references to Soviet abuse of psychiatry in the past. Thank you very much again, and I'll see you next time.